Microphone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening. Welcome to News from Neptune for the 27th week of 2016. I'm Carl Estabrook. For a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was no platformed there. No platforming is a recent coinage in the university and the media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what's being said. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for more than half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, Karen, Aram, David Green, and I will try to say some true things. It's July 8th in a busy week in which, among other things, our program was mentioned in a letter to the editor of the local daily, the News Gazette. We've had disobliging things to say about the editorial practices of the News Gazette on one occasion or another. In fact, I'm not sure how often we've had obliging things to say about what the News Gazette has done editorially, but I will say that the letters column in the News Gazette is one of the few places in this town in the days of the internet when people follow things that they agree with and not things that they don't agree with. The letters column in the News Gazette is one of the few places in town where different political views actually are juxtaposed, that they manage to elicit letters from local citizens, often to different effect. It's not always to the same effect at all. There was one this week, as I say, that refers to us, that the News Gazette people headlined, Criticism of Wars Unfair to Veterans. The letter went like this. When channel surfing, I occasionally encounter Aware on the Air and News from Neptune on the Urbana Cable TV channel. They offer an alternative interpretation of news. In one recent discussion, the word warmonger was used over and over. It was applied to the upcoming elections, presidential candidates, political parties, the U.S. government, industry, economics, and social issues. This caught my attention, especially in light of the recent Memorial Day, Normandy invasion anniversary, and Independence Day commemorations. The author of the letter continues, there's no argument that war is a terrible thing, and the Neptune hosts are certainly free to express this opinion. However, I thought the tone of these discussions was offensive, grossly disrespectful of the men and women of the armed services, and totally oblivious to their courage and sacrifice. Have the Aware Neptune hosts ever spoken with military veterans? Have they ever sought the perspective of the greatest generation? I suspect few were eager to risk their lives in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific Islands. I think he thinks we're even older than we actually are, but still. You know. The letter writer continues, but they, my father included, did anyway and would do so again under similar circumstances. Are the Neptune hosts even capable of comprehending this sense of duty and commitment? Would they ever acknowledge the sensitivities of these individuals who put themselves in harm's way for the rest of us? Well, there's an awful lot to say about that brief letter. We might begin with the last point, that veterans of the American Armed Forces put themselves in harm's way for the rest of us. It's not at all clear that that's what happened. When we say that American veterans were fighting for our freedom in the Second World War, as well as Vietnam, Korea, and the other wars of the present generation throughout the world, a little historical insight will lead us to conclude, I think, that our freedom was never at stake. What was at stake was the freedom of the property of the American 1%, the freedom of capital to maintain the economic control of the world that the U.S. found itself having at the end of the Second World War as the only undamaged major country to emerge from that war. At the very heart of what this program and the other one that is mentioned here on UPTV, Aware on the Air, are doing is the notion that the most propagandized people in perhaps all of history are the American populace, and particularly on the question of war. We don't notice how true it is that the American public from the very beginning, from the so-called Revolutionary War on, has always been adverse to war. The point was made by the second president of the United States, John Adams, when he said a third of the country is always opposed to war. The soundest part of the country, he said, is always opposed to the war. That's true. And if we go over the history of America's wars, we find in each case that the government representatives of the ruling class have had to coerce or manipulate the populace in supporting that war, whether we talk about the American Revolution, the Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, or the wars of the 20th century, or the wars of the 21st century. There is a natural drag against these wars. Americans are not stupid. They don't want to go and kill people around the world and take the chance of being killed. And it's only when they are convinced by American leaders that such wars really are in some sense in their interest that they're willing to do so. Our task here on the programs where we talk about politics is to point out the falsity of this propaganda. Just a word more about that notion warmonger. The writer of the letter suggests the term is overused in this program. I think if anything, we're underusing it. It's a good old Germanic term. A monger is somebody who sells something. And indeed, there's a notion of duplicity and manipulativeness buried in the word. The fishmonger is one of the ways in which the word is used, and it's not, for the most part, a complimentary term. The notion is the fish may be a little older than the merchant pretends they are. The only other major English usage today is whoremonger for the keeper of a brothel. These are not complimentary terms, and a monger, as someone who is dealing in suspect goods, seems to me a pretty good way to talk about those people who have tried to sell war to reluctant Americans for generations. The question of warmongering is indeed at the very center, it seems to me, of the sorts of things we should be talking about, because the United States remains, as Martin Luther King said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. So we should take a look at the mongering. Why is war being mongered, and what lies are being told in its furtherance? I think one of the things that makes the current administration stand out is the sophistication of its duplicity in this area. The Obama administration was elected twice by co-opting the anti-war movement. Obama convinced Americans that he was opposed to war more than his opponents were, and Americans voted for him, at least in part, on that understanding. In fact, Obama has expanded the wars he inherited and has done it while distracting the American public from what, in fact, he's doing. A warmonger par excellence. It's not at all clear that his probable successor, Mrs. Clinton, is going to be as sophisticated a warmonger as Barack Obama is, but it is clear that she's going to monger war for us at least as much as Mr. Obama does. And the quite remarkable thing in the midst of the present presidential election is that her probable opponent is indeed taking another tack. The Trump campaign is substantially more anti-war, is substantially anti-war, and the Clinton campaign is pro-war. The difference, although that's not what's being talked about in the news, the difference is as sharp as that in any presidential campaign for more than 40 years. In fact, I think you have to go back to the early 70s to find as strong a difference between a pro-war and an anti-war candidate in the American presidential election. Instead, we've gotten the sort of fudging that's been common to American war making in the last generation in American presidential elections. It's changed. So you're listening to News from Neptune, a Who's the Warmonger edition, and we'll begin with Karen Aram.
Well, I just want to say that in response to someone questioning war, I guess when I was a teenager, instead of reading romance novels, I was reading books about war. I went into detail, and I came to the conclusion that war is the greatest evil. And I say that because if you take an umbrella and then you put it, you take a group of rape, you take murder, you take poverty, you take enslavement, you take torture, you put all of these things, and control, destruction, you put all of these things under an umbrella. And that umbrella is called war, okay? In other words, it encompasses all of the greatest horrors that anyone could imagine. And I use the word imagine. I also know that when I became involved in the anti-war movement in D.C., that was during the Vietnam War, I was working with what I thought were Quakers, because one or two of the leaders were Quakers. And then I discovered, when I pointed out that I didn't blame the young men who were going to Vietnam, most had been drafted at the time, for what was taking place, I had sympathy for them. I embraced the attitude that if you want to support our soldiers, you bring them home. And then it was pointed out to me that the majority of the people I was working with were actually veterans. They had already been to Vietnam. They had already seen and experienced war, and now they were working very strongly on behalf of the anti-war movement. And a lot of the information that we get related to war comes from what, Tom Dispatch, Carl? And who runs Tom Dispatch?
Tom Engelhardt.
Tom Engelhardt, an ex-vet. And I know you're on a veterans website as well. In other words, we're not people who just sit and make up these things. we have talked to veterans of war. We have, and if nothing else, we do have a good idea what it encompasses. Now, I was going to mention something taking place in Asia that I just heard yesterday, actually, and that is that the U.S., along with our sanctions against North Korea, we are now going to deploy, I would refer to it as TAD, with our U.S. forces in Korea. TAD actually is an acronym for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, okay? So that's going to be deployed within the U.S. forces in South Korea. Now, this has been let's put it this way, repeatedly, nations in the surrounding area have repeatedly voiced serious concerns over this deployment on the Korean Peninsula, as its radar can locate missiles far beyond the DPRK territory, or the Democratic Republic of Korea, or North Korea. Now, in response, Russia will deploy missile units in the east in response to U.S. missile defense in South Korea, says Moscow. So here we are, more provocations in Asia. I've talked extensively about U.S. battleships, meaning nuclear-armed ships that are in the South China Sea, provoking China. And I'm not going to go into that right now. We'll see what happens after the 12th, what the decision from the criminal court or from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea comes down, not how China reacts, but how the U.S. reacts. We know that the U.S. is building up, they are building up our military in that area in anticipation of potential war in 2020 with China. Now, what we're really doing, I think, is utilizing our proxies in Southeast Asia to foment war. Just as, now this brings me to Europe, just as we've been utilizing our proxies throughout Europe to foment war with Russia. And I want to mention that I did talk about this article previously about Brexit and the return of European militarism, and how at the first EU summit without British participation that was held last Wednesday in Brussels, the 27 remaining EU government heads agreed on paper, authored by the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Mogherini is her name. It's titled Global Strategy for European Foreign and Security Policy. Now, at the heart of this paper is the argument that the EU must become an aggressive world power capable of intervening militarily and, if necessary, waging war independently of NATO and the U.S. Now, I'm not going to go into too much more detail on this now, because I think it's important to note that even before Brexit, even before the UK left the EU, there was talk about the EU building up their military. Now, we know that Germany has been building up their military. We were told it was primarily against what they saw the U.S. doing, but the EU would be an alternative to NATO. Now, Steinmeier, his name is Walter Frank Steinmeier, he is the foreign minister of Germany. He has been advocating for this on the basis that then they can go back to doing negotiations, utilizing diplomacy, sitting down and working out their problems with other nations. Primarily because most European nations do not want war with Russia, and they recognize that it's the U.S. that wants to see them at war with Russia. Poland is probably the most aggressive in this, what we would call as our ally, and we know that they have their tanks. We have NATO tanks and missiles all around the border of Russia right now. I mean, this is so dangerous. What needs to be understood, though, is that most of the Europeans don't want this. So there is actually a very positive attribute to the weakening of NATO. And that is the fact that they know also that they're not being given security. Their borders are not more secure because of NATO. NATO is primarily there as a geopolitical instrument to foment war with Russia. And this was not what they had envisioned after the Cold War. So there's also a lot of talk about how because of NATO, because of the EU, the sanctions that have been placed have left a lot of European nations in poverty. There's an article, a very good article I recommend, written by, you say his name, Carl, he's a friend of yours?
Not so much that I can pronounce his name correctly. Gary Leupp, L-E-U-P-P.
Yeah, he writes in Counterpunch. He's a professor at
Tufts,
okay.
Massachusetts.
And he's written an excellent article calling, and the title of his article is Imagining a Different Europe, Brexit and the Future of NATO. I was also watching an interview on Peter Lavelle's Crosstalk this morning. It's filmed on RT. And David Swanson was on that program, and he was he was making some excellent comments. He said, what we would like to see is demilitarization of all of the EU nations, demilitarization of all of them. But most of all, there's no question, demilitarization of NATO, because there's no question that the U.S. has only one goal, and that is containment, control, and reckless destruction, if necessary, of Russia and China. So I think that it's very important for people to really watch what's happening with the EU and with what we call Brexit, and I see it as positive, the weakening of NATO. First of all, we actually fund, I think, 3/4 of the funding for NATO.
Just about.
Comes from the U.S., and thereby control. There have been protests across Europe against NATO, Greece, Serbia, Moldova, because they recognize the dangers that are implicit in the reckless use of nuclear weapons. So when we talk about war, it's very, very important to understand who has been behind most of the warmongering. Steinmeier actually referred, the foreign minister of Germany, actually referred to the U.S. as warmongers. We know that Hillary Clinton, who's running for election, we know from her past behavior as Secretary of State that she supports war, the total destruction and deaths of Libya. And we know that she was involved in regime change in Honduras. Leaves no doubt where she would go, that she would continue going forward if or when she becomes president. So I constantly have to remind people that because she's a woman doesn't mean that she's any more sensitive to other women and children, because she is responsible for a lot of deaths. But when people criticize people who are anti-war, that somehow we're insulting our servicemen, I think they really have to take a look at the big picture and recognize how dangerous and how horrific war really is. And again, I want to support the breaking up of NATO, and I hope that it happens and that it's a positive event, and that even if the EU does remilitarize, which I can't imagine a foreign minister going and suggesting otherwise if he wants to move further away from NATO. So I think this is the direction that we're headed, so I see that as positive.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching News from Neptune. We'll go to David Green. What's on your mind, David?
Oh, goodness. You put a lot out there.
Yes.
I obviously have to do some research on what NATO really spends, because I read that the European countries are required to contribute 2% of their GDP to NATO.
And the
And if the United States is supporting 3/4 of NATO plus 2% of the GDP of the EU, which is probably larger than the GDP of the United States, they've got a lot of money to play around with. I mean, they've got more money to play around with than the American military budget of which is conservatively $600 billion, but of course it's much more when you include everything that we really spend on spying and veterans benefits and everything else.
What the Americans complain about is that the other NATO members don't pony up. The agreement is 2%, but nobody else, nobody pays their assessment.
Well, our military budget, just for us in this country, is usually estimated at 3 to 4%. So if the Europeans are paying 2% and then we're adding 3/4 more to that, maybe that NATO budget is included in that 4%, in that $600 billion. If it's not, then it must be a large sum. I've got to do some research on this.
Yeah, check it out, because my understanding was that it's not included in our military budget.
Yeah.
And that's why they say there's a lot that goes into supporting war and military that it doesn't show up in the budget for the military. I had read that before. And you're right, 2% is what each European nation is required to contribute in order to then become a member of the EU. So yeah, and Professor Luke lays it out here for us. Yeah.
Well, let me carry on with whatever it was I am going to say or am not going to say. This notion of that you counter criticism of war by saying that we don't respect veterans, it's just meant to stifle any conversation, and that would seem to go against the idea that we're fighting for freedom. I mean, it's not that they are fighting for freedom, but there are so many levels of hypocrisy and disingenuousness in the argument that Tom Napier, the letter writer, who used to live actually not far from me over in the Clark Park area.
Neighbors.
Never met the man, as far as I could tell, but I've conversed with him on the comments page of the newspaper. He's an avid supporter of the chief. He always plays the respect card. He always plays the politeness card, that it's not so much what you're talking about, it's how you're talking about it. And I'm all for civil discourse. I'm all, sometimes I let my hair down a little on the News Gazette comment section, but I like to keep things by and large fairly straightforward. Once in a while I lose my patience, and once in a while I have a little fun, and once in a while I get a little sarcastic, but there it is. It's the comments page, for crying out loud. I would compliment him on one thing. He uses his name when he comments, as do I. He uses his real name, assuming that's who he really is. World War II. I was probably 20 years old before I knew that anybody's father didn't fight in World War II. I grew up, I knew World War II veterans from the time I was a day old. I mean, what is he talking about? What does he think? He knows how old I am. What does he think? And he probably knows how old you are too, Carl. Yeah. And he and Ron and everyone else.
Don't tell how old I am.
And I don't know how old you are, Karen. You never say.
I actually do.
But in any event, it's like you grew up in a neighborhood where everybody's father fought in World War II. Right. If you were bookish and historically minded like me, your parents got you these wonderful, I guess, Time Life, huge folio-sized Time Life books where you could follow every battle, the whole war through every single battle, and that's what I did till I was a teenager. I never read anything critical about war in general, or about America's wars in general, let's say. For that, I didn't read anything critical about World War II. It's a concession for someone like me to say, to basically say, well, since World War II, I feel like all of America's wars have been unjustly fought. I could include World War II in that, but I don't want to waste time making that argument. Read the book Ernest Mandel, a good Marxist historian, The Meaning of World War II, and one can come to understand about that. And of course, we're talking about World War II. We're talking about veterans. We kind of slip in these sliding signifiers. You refer to World War II, which was, of course, the good war, and then since then, well, things have gone a little downhill. But as long as we've got these World War II vets around, let's put a story about them in the newspaper every week, and let's kind of lump in all the succeeding veterans with the kind of aura of the good war. And I don't think it works with very many people, but of course, most people are too polite, and probably rightfully so, to want to raise the issues of why all these people who have their war stories from World War II on forward in the newspaper, they all survived. None of them got hurt. Some of them have some interesting stories to tell. They're all white, and none of them opposed the wars. So they're Vietnam or Korea or or Persian Gulf War, whatever war they might be referring to. That's who shows up in these weekly stories in the News Gazette about those who served. Okay, fine, I'm not going to complain about that. I'm not going to waste a letter upsetting people by. I don't talk about veterans. I talk about wars. I talk about as we do on these programs. We talk about the economic and geopolitical motives for these wars. It took me a long time even to oppose the war in Vietnam. It was hard for me to oppose the war when I was still living at home with my parents, liberal as they were. It was hard for me to oppose the Vietnam War until I left home and felt freer to criticize that. I had my problems with it, but I didn't have that much to read in my own household other than Time magazine and the LA Times to really inform me about what the arguments were against the Vietnam War. So I wasn't born this way. I had to learn these things. I had to figure out these things. It's nothing personal. It's not veterans' fault. We could talk about people going to war, especially in the volunteer era, because they have no other options. We could talk about them going to war for reasons that I wouldn't approve of. But it's really not about them. It's about our leadership and about our ruling class. Obviously, these are the things that Tom Napier doesn't want to talk about. But speaking of World War II, it seems to me if you want to understand that, if you want to understand the Holocaust, which is which is deservedly or undeservedly the signifying feature of World War II. In other words, 11 million out of the 50 million people who died as a result of World War II died of the Holocaust, 6 million of those being Jews. And in the wake of the death of Elie Wiesel, the most famous survivor of the Holocaust, who was at Auschwitz as a teenage boy, there's been some controversy, including apparently Hillary Clinton chiming in on criticism of Elie Wiesel, which is long-standing, which is nothing new. He's been exposed as rather a fraud in various ways. I don't care to discuss his literature, how true it is, whether he made up stuff. What I'm more concerned about is that he didn't really oppose war. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, didn't really oppose war. He didn't oppose genocide when it wasn't in his opportunistic interest to do so. For example, the Armenian genocide as being included in the general area of genocide studies. He didn't oppose, as he became a famous person, won the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1980s and continued for the last 30 years to be the voice, undeservedly, I would think, of Holocaust survivors. He hasn't voiced opposition to U.S. foreign policy. He has been most criticized for not being critical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people. I think fairly enough. You could read what Corey Robin had to say about that this week on his blog. You could read an article by Max Blumenthal on Alternet, which is a good review and overview of that. You can go back and read Norman Finkelstein's book, The Whole Holocaust Industry, and you can see the whole unfolding beginning in the 70s and for the last 40 years, but really revving up in the 1980s and really peaking in the 1990s of the manner in which the Holocaust was exploited to support Israel's behavior and U.S. support for Israel and all kinds of other things. You know that when you hear Wiesel talking about genocide, you're going to hear the usual sort of worthy victims scenario. You're not going to hear about East Timor, but you are going to hear about Darfur, just to point out a couple of obviously hypocritical examples of. I was never impressed with the man. I'm not interested in the man. I'm not particularly interested in the study. No longer am I interested in the study of the Holocaust as it proceeds on college campuses. I know there's a lot of rhetoric. I know there's a lot of discourse. I know there's a lot of research. I'm a little cynical about that because I think the research is being done because the money is being donated to do the research. I'm not really interested in visiting a Holocaust museum. I never have. I never will. I've tried to come to understand the Holocaust in the context of World War II, just like we should try to understand veterans in the context of the wars for which they fought. And that just brings me back to the basic point that these are wars that have to be understood relatively abstractly, really, aside from all the stories and aside from all the tragedy and the human suffering, need to be understood rather dispassionately and analytically in the context of the interests of those who are fighting those wars.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune, a Who's the Warmonger edition. And we have found ourselves talking a good bit about the American approach to war then and now, then being the Second World War, now being the current Obama administration wars in the Southwest Asia, in MENA, the Middle East and North Africa. The Obama administration quietly announced this week that the American forces in Afghanistan will remain at the level of more than 8,000 for the foreseeable future. In other words, long after Obama has left office and well into the Clinton administration, probably. It's interesting to note in passing that Barack Obama is in fact the first American president to be at war through the entire 8 years of 2 presidential terms. That wasn't true of anyone else, from Franklin Roosevelt to George Bush II. And it's quite remarkable, and it says something about the way in which America fights wars in the 21st century. It's not a happy prospect. In speaking of the Second World War, I can do no better, I think, than recommend to you Nicholson Baker's remarkable book, Human Smoke, that came out in 2008, in which Baker, who is a novelist by profession, simply reads the newspapers from the run-up to the Second World War and into the war, and gives you selections of what was being said then, true and false, about the war, and presents an unparalleled picture of the coming of the war, very different from the sorts of mythology that most Americans, particularly Americans of our generation, or my generation and the next generation, grew up with. It's important to get a good account here, a good account of what that war was like. Baker has written a summary piece, the subtitle of which is The Dangerous Myth of the Good War. The good war, of course, being the wonderful crusade where the U.S. set out to save the world from Nazism, fascism, and other assorted evils. Most Americans don't know, of course, that the war against Nazism was won in the East, was won by Russia, and that the Russians lost 27 million people in that war. U.S. casualties in the Second World War didn't amount to 500,000. The importance of David's remark that when he was growing up, why everyone's father fought in the war, I think is actually says something about the nature of American politics over the last 2 generations. In fact, very few Americans actually fought in the Second World War, but their lives were certainly organized by the establishment of the American Army and, even more, the industrial production that underlay the Allied victory against the Axis powers in Europe. What was happening here was that the American ascendancy, the American establishment, was finding its way out of the Depression. The Depression, for all the things that the Great Depression of the 1930s was solved, for all the things that the Roosevelt administration did, worthwhile things, to deal with the great human costs of the Depression, it was in fact war production that produced an end to the Great Depression, not the Roosevelt policies, not the New Deal policies. Therefore, the great problem of American industry, of American government after the Second World War, after the war ended in 1945, was if the war had solved the Depression, now that the war was over, the Depression was due back and something must be done. Well, the answer was to keep the war going by other means, the war in this case meaning that organization of the American populace that led David to believe that everybody's father had fought in the war.
On my block, you know.
Sure. Well, what they were
were in the military.
In the military, or their industry was organized for the war. That was true. It was a great social re-engineering of the American society that produced the end of the Depression, but it was done under, as it were, false pretenses. We needed the propaganda, the understanding that the U.S. had marched out and saved the world. None of that was true, but that was what was necessary in order to make the social changes in this country that brought the Depression to an end. His subsequent history of the United States is the use of that mythology to maintain the economic organization of the world dominated by the American elite, and to convince Americans there was a good reason for it. In fact, it seems to me that in some ways, as we look back on it now, the great problem for the American ruling class in the 1960s was that the myth was challenged by Vietnam. At the beginning of the 1960s, when John Kennedy inaugurated the war in South Vietnam, everyone believed what David was just talking about, that the Second World War had been this great crusade, and of course the crusade was simply continuing now against what was essentially the same enemy, call it Nazism, call it communism, with still those foreigners.
Totalitarianism.
There we are. We had a common term for it, and we changed horses and rode on.
Although Hannah Arendt probably didn't support the Vietnam War. I can't imagine she did.
Well, actually, she's had some very interesting things to say about it. But,
okay.
But the point is that the 60s, the threat of the 60s to the American ruling class was a threat to the story, was a threat to the propaganda. The interesting aspect of the American 20th century was that American rulers found in the course of the 20th century that they really couldn't control their populace by prison and military force, that they had to persuade the populace by lying to them that it was necessary to support the American ascendancy. Now that myth, that mythology, came apart in the 1960s. That was the real problem of the 1960s. No one doubted the myth of the Second World War, the myth of the Good War, at the beginning of the 1960s in the United States. By the end of the 1960s, a majority of Americans thought that the war in Vietnam was not a mistake, but it was a crime. It was immoral. It was wrong, not because it wasn't effective. It was wrong because it was wrong to kill these Asians for the benefits of the American 1%.
Carl, on the war effort, I should mention that my father tried to get into the war. He couldn't, based on health issues. So he ended up working in the industrial war effort, which was why I was born and raised in Ohio. They left Pennsylvania. But both my uncles on my mother's side were in World War II. My one uncle actually was one of the first Rangers, they call them Rangers, to land on Anzio Beach. And my mother pointed out that when he came back, he, like the other, they never talked about it. A lot of veterans will not talk about it, but he was never the same, she said. He left as a 17-year-old, like a lot of the kids did at that time. He was never the same. Now, I was so, let's say, appalled when I read about the Holocaust. First I read the story of Anne Frank, and then that led me to the Holocaust. I put the Holocaust under the same umbrella as war. I put genocide under the same umbrella as war. I put what we did to the Native Americans under the same umbrella as war. A lot of these atrocities I put under the same umbrella as war. And that's what started me reading about war, and then my later anti-war activities. And I think that where we are now, and I actually liked Eli Wiesel. I thought he was great back in the 60s, because to me, bringing these Nazis, these terrible people, to justice, I was willing to say, hey, go to whatever ends. If you have to go to Argentina and kidnap them, by all means. I was ready to sign up, but I was too young.
Well, he wasn't the one.
No, but he led that effort, didn't he? I mean,
no, he didn't.
Oh, I thought he did. So
the propaganda effort. Yeah.
Well, there was
whatever.
The most well-known person is the great Nazi was Simon Wiesenthal. You may be getting him mixed up with Simon Wiesenthal.
Okay, you know what? I may be.
Not very well.
I'm sorry. That's very possible. I
But
get
that's
the two
okay. It
mixed
doesn't
up.
matter. It doesn't
Anyway,
matter.
but I was appalled when I hear anyone who is familiar with the Holocaust. I think this, to me, is what is appalling. And then they see what Israel is doing today. I mean, I found it incomprehensible when I recognized the atrocities that Israel has been committing against Palestinians, given what so many of their people had been through. And so I find it appalling when I see anyone somehow supporting that supporting any form of.
I understand that, but I have to say, it's like, yes, that's a good reason for Israelis not to want to do what was done unto them. But people have always done what was done unto them. I mean, it's nothing new for Israel to be doing.
Right.
And it's not even the same people doing
Right.
unto others what was done to them. There are Holocaust survivors. I mean, Holocaust survivors came to Palestine after World War II. The people before that were just people fleeing, but the Holocaust survivors arrived after World War II in mandatory Palestine became Israel in 1948. I don't want to go too far afield with this, but it's like the argument. I mean, Israel's doing what it's doing because it's thrown in a slot with the U.S. empire,
Right.
and
right.
it's doing the people there are doing. We're doing the people who came to this country, who were
Right.
kicked out of wherever they came from,
Right.
done unto others what was done to them.
Exactly.
I mean, that's nothing new. Jews shouldn't be held to a higher standard in that regard.
That's
it's just
true.
that the hypocrisy in this case tends to be really obvious, and the fact that the Holocaust is so exploited in the context of that, in the rhetorical context of that, is what makes it particularly appalling. And these things are actually understood by a lot of people in Israel of the more open-minded classes. And it actually, Elie Wiesel wasn't particularly thought of in Israel. I mean, people understood in Israel. There's a phrase: "There's no business like Shoah business," and Elie Wiesel was very much seen as a part of that. He was seen, quite frankly, and I think I'm using the proper translation of the word. He was seen as a kind of a clown by many Israelis who have a somewhat different relationship to the Holocaust, however reprehensible the behavior of their government is in relation to the Palestinians and so forth.
To explain that bitter remark, we should mention that Shoah is basically Hebrew for Holocaust. Eh?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
And
Well, it's like being Irish, okay? Most people who are of Irish descent, we grew up hearing about
Of
the way
course.
the British treated the Irish in Ireland. And so I'm third or fourth generation, but I thought that the British were the enemy growing up because it was all about Ireland. Look at, so what,
Well, they
I mean,
were.
it's identity but it's identity politics. When we don't,
well,
when we
it's not
only
quite.
look at what was being done to us or our people. So yeah, here again, I think war is an umbrella that encompasses so many things that needs to be discouraged in many, many ways.
In W.H. Auden's poem about the outbreak of the Second World War, September 1st, 1939, Auden writes, "I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return."
That's true.
He's talking about the Germans in September 1st, 1939, but of course it is, as you two suggest, far too generally applicable.
Was he implying that evil was done to Germany?
Exactly.
Say the settlements
was.
after
Exactly.
World War I?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I actually understood that. I do want to make it clear that I study the Holocaust as a historical event. People can certainly, if well-written memoirs of the Holocaust, Primo Levi, I think, is much better known literarily than Elie Wiesel, but his politics weren't the same, and he was critical. Primo Levi, the Italian Holocaust survivor, was very critical of the way Wiesel conducted a campaign to kind of market himself as the representative of Holocaust, of concentration camp survivors. But that's all very complicated, but I don't expect in high school for them to be reading complicated historical works by the people that I respect most in this field, like Ian Kershaw, Arno Mayer, and so forth. And Saul Friedlander is also one that I would want to throw in there. It's more tedious than reading stories about the Holocaust. People certainly should understand what people are capable of. The Holocaust is a particularly, in some ways, uniquely gruesome example of that, but it's not unique in its gruesomeness. It's not. It was unique in the sort of industrial and mass nature of the killing, but it doesn't stand alone.
This examination of American mythology about war the mythology that most of our fellow citizens entertain is particularly worthwhile and should be brought up to date in terms of the discussion of war and the existence of an American war policy and the war policy of the coming administrations. Remarkably enough, as I mentioned earlier, this is the first election in a long time where these things have really been at issue in the sense there's a disagreement between the two major candidates. Before, it was all a matter of saying, well, of course, we're fighting terrorism, but the question is, are we being effective in doing it? There is a real disagreement about war between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and that is being put aside by the actual discussion in the campaign, which is all about Trump's bigotry. The policy implications for the world at large are overwhelming. They are indeed in the campaign, and they're not being noted, not by accident, by the American media. There was a speech given in Russia this week by the leading foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump, a man called Carter Page, a businessman who has Russian interests. And it was described as follows. An American foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump chided the United States on Thursday for an often hypocritical focus in its dealings with Russia, China, and Central Asia. Now, as Karen suggested earlier, this is the central foreign policy question for the United States today and the basis of the absolutely outrageous provocations and riskings of war that the Obama administration is involved in. Now, here's Trump's advisor saying that Washington has missed opportunities, he put it that gently, missed opportunities to work with leaders such as Russia's Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping because it had ignored principles of respect, equality, and mutual benefit. He's quoting Putin there. Now, this is being said by the major advisor to the Republican candidate, and this is about as far as it can be from the the belligerent Democratic war policy that we get from the White House and the Democratic candidate. And even the Washington Post, which I'm quoting from here, had to note that Page's remarks put him, like Trump, at sharp odds with the Obama administration and traditional Republican policy circles. That's an interesting way to put it because, of course, there's Democratic policy circles too, which have viewed Russia in more adversarial terms. Now, you really have to wash that one out. What he's talking about is the immense provocation of Russia coming from the Democratic administration and usually from Republican candidates as well. Trump represents a departure from that. Now, everyone says, oh, we can't believe what Trump says, as if we could believe what Obama and Clinton could say when they were talking about similar things. But the fact of the matter is, something different is being said in the midst of this campaign, and it's being swept under the rug by the media and, of course, by the Democrats who want to ignore this criticism of their belligerent policies as much as they can. This seems to me to be a very real failure of American political discourse and an immensely dangerous one.
The greater failure is not hearing from the third-party candidates, Jill Stein being one who I support in representing the Green Party, and her whole platform is basically a green platform, diverting energy to oil drilling and destruction of the environment, to green energy. But she also has a policy of eliminating student debt. And the main thing is that she does not take any corporate funding for her program. But neither she nor the Libertarian Party has a chance to even be heard. So I think that's an even more grievous
But it should be said that
media.
it's official now that Jill Stein in the slate, her vice presidential candidate, as well as a U.S. senatorial candidate, and a candidate for state comptroller will be on the ballot in this state, thanks to the minute efforts of me and Karen and a couple thousand other people in this state. Probably about 50 of which did most of the work, and the rest of us did a little bit each.
And the immense moral support that I lent you, right?
Absolutely. We couldn't have done it, Carl, without your moral support.
Right.
It would be better if I gathered signatures.
Can I sneak in one thing here?
Sure.
I really wanted to mention Jeffrey St. Clair's article on today's Counterpunch, which actually is an excerpt from a book that's several years old called Grand Theft Pentagon, about the selling of the Iraq War. It's obviously posted there because in the wake of what's the report called? The British report called?
Chilcot.
I keep wanting to call it the Corbyn.
Actually,
I keep wanting to call it the Corbyn report,
Right,
but
right.
I'm getting my wires crossed there.
Sure, John Chilcot was the head of the
But
commission.
it's like, what St. Clair was completely all over years ago in the selling of the Iraq War in this country was that it was marketed. It wasn't really about
Right.
truth or lies. It was about marketing, just like anything else. And you have to note, this is probably an unfair dig, but boy, there was a lot of women involved in promoting this war from the marketing perspective, from a PR perspective. I mean, I'm not saying women, men. I'm just saying that there's obviously there was no gender differences there among elites who are willing to serve power.
Well, exactly.
and lie to serve power.
Well, just look at the blacks that are in charge. Obama, the Attorney General. I mean, now we have Loretta Lynch, and what are they doing for African Americans in this country? I mean, nothing. And many of the black leaders are beginning to really speak out on that. So I think we have to recognize that you have to vote for people based on policy and behavior, not based upon, what they may say or how they make you feel good about what they represent. That's, identity politics, which is your specialty. Both of you.
Well, I don't think so. But
Well, I think you're both very good at discussing it.
You're discussing it, critiquing it, up to a
Critiquing it,
point.
yeah.
I try not to think about it, actually.
You've been watching News from Neptune, a Who's the Warmonger edition, and I'd like to close with some remarks with a brief remark from Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party, who is under assault from the neoliberal members of that party, associated with the former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Corbyn is quite an admirable figure and has said very important things, and it's a real indication of the general breakdown of elite control of British politics, which is paralleled, in fact, in the United States, that Corbyn has become head of the Labour Party. And a furious attempt to oust him on the part of the neoliberal wing of the Labour Party seems to have failed, but the dispute is still very real, and anyone who doubted that there was merely a gradation from liberal to left in American and British politics certainly has been disabused of that notion by recent events in both countries. The left position that Jeremy Corbyn represents on questions of war and the economy contrasts quite sharply with the liberal position, indeed finally a neoliberal position, and neoconservative position represented by the British establishment and represented in this country by the American political establishment, notably Hillary Clinton. The break is very great, and the failure, apparently, of Bernie Sanders to realize that there's a break there that he's on the other side of, and his willingness to paper it over with the Clinton campaign is one of the great scandals of the moment. I'm really quite shocked by it, and when I fall asleep at night, I dream of Bernie Sanders saying at the convention, look, I can't support this woman. What she's saying is opposed to everything I've said all along, which it is, and therefore I won't. So wait and see. Maybe my dreams will come true. Here is Jeremy Corbyn on the question of warmongers.
I'll tell you what I was dreaming. NATO, yeah.
Corbyn says,
You guys have some strange bedtime behaviors.
Jeremy Corbyn, we have leaders who are in love with war, but their people aren't. We don't believe that the solution to bloodshed is bloodshed. Murder is murder. We want to live in a world free from war, and we're prepared to stand up to the warmongers. Now, that's the conclusion and the answer, it seems, the proper answer, it seems to me, to the letter writer in the News Gazette who suggested that we were preoccupied with warmongers. He, of course, is exactly right. The question is to see who the warmongers are
Right.
and how, indeed, they can be opposed.
Right.
We're preoccupied with warmongers because the warmongers are occupying everybody else.
Exactly. Exactly.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 27th week of 2016, a Who's the Warmonger edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Karen Aram and David Green. Our thanks to directors and producers, Jason and Yosef. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.